Good day, everyone. My name is Derek Johnson. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Manitoba. I would like to welcome you to this webinar presentation by Dr. Amrita Sen of her new book published by Routledge entitled A Political Ecology of Forest Conservation in India, Communities, Wildlife, and the State. Dr. Sen's presentation is part of an occasional presentation series hosted by the Dried Fish Matters Partnership Grant Project, on which I am project director. Dried Fish Matters is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for the purpose of undertaking the first systematic analysis of the social, economic, nutritional, and governance aspects of the dried fish sector in South and Southeast Asia. Dr. Sen's research is of direct relevance to the Dried Fish Matters project for its political ecology and fisheries themes, and also for its geographical focus on the Sundarbans region of northeastern India, an area where the Dried Fish Matters project is also working. Indeed, the connection is even more direct than that, as Dr. Sen has brought her expertise into the Dried Fish Matters project, previously as a postdoctoral fellow working with the project, and now as an assistant professor. Following Dr. Sen's presentation of approximately 40 minutes, there will be an opportunity for questions from the audience. The session will close with concluding remarks from Dr. Jinya Mukherjee. Dr. Mukherjee is an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, and the leader of the West Bengal research team in the Dried Fish Matters project. Before I invite Dr. Sen to begin her presentation, I will ask Dr. Mukherjee to give Dr. Sen a proper introduction. So, Dr. Mukherjee, let me pass the floor to you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Johnson, for the introduction and also, for this opportunity. And I think I met Amrita 6-7 years back when she was pursuing her MPhil at Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and I just started my teaching career at the Institute of Development Studies, Kolkata. And I think it's an opportunity for both of us that we are colleagues now at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. And I must say that, Amrita's work and her extensive research on the Indian Sundarbans, this is pathbreaking in the sense that, this thesis also received the Best Thesis Award from IIT Bombay, which is a big thing. And Amrita also has her supervisor here, who also happens to be the student of Amita Bhaviskar, who is a very well-known political ecologist and sociologist who has focused on cultural politics. And I think this book, I was also definitely going through this book today afternoon, and I very much know that how this book remains crucial for our understanding of this, for better understanding of the empirical findings that we are gathering, and we have also started compiling so far as our dry fish project is concerned within the empirical context of West Bengal. So to be very brief, I think this particular book is important because it also complicates political ecology. Political ecology is such an evolving, dynamic, transforming field. And I think the kind of analytics that Amrita has used in this particular book, for example, political intermediations, and also, cultural politics, because this lens of cultural politics, I think it's an enabler to make us understand that why symbolic, values to resources are also very important. And I think this is also something which is very, very crucial in terms of our understanding on dry fish, that beyond relational and material, components, why symbolic values are so very important. So I think that, Amrita's involvement in the dry fish project is very significant in terms of, I think, two components or two aspects. So one is that the theoretical or conceptual frameworks and approaches that she has used in this book and she has expertise on. This is we are absolutely optimizing on it because we are now able to understand that any kind of ethnographic understanding or ethnographic exercise remains incomplete without understanding structural complexities. Right, structural complexities and power relations, or this resource politics that are imbricated within a particular landscape. And this particular landscape is so exciting and enthralling, the Indian Sundarbans, right? The volatile ecologies of Sundarbans. And the second important point is that, Amrita's extensive research on the Indian Sundarbans for more than half a decade now is very, very significant in terms of the fact that like she has rapport and she has connections with, I think, supralocal institutions and local agencies and organizations. And thus, I think her involvement in the dry fish matters project, West Bengal component is very significant. So finally, I think that the project is also like giving Amrita and all of us whole lot of incentives. It's offering lots of incentives to us because it is providing us with very new and fresh empirical insights through which we are being able to, inform, complicate, interrogate, and also reify the theoretical or conceptual frameworks with which we work, or for example, in which our long-term research interests anchor. For example, political ecology and environmental humanities. So I think I'll not waste further time, and I would now request Amrita to give her presentation, mainly on her book, and also addressing the intersection between her book, her research on the Indian Sundarbans, and the West Bengal Dry Fish Matters project.
Thank you so much, Jinia Di. I think Jinia Di actually made my task much more easier by providing such a nice summary of the book that I had written. And thank you so much, Derek and Eric. I think it's an honor to be here for me because I'm extremely excited because this is the first book talk, and I am really looking forward more to the comments and the questions that I received today on the book that I had written. So in the interest of time, I would like directly go to the topic to discuss some observations from the main chapters, from the empirical chapters. But before that, I would also like to, as Jinia was mentioning, that this book is about the political ecology framing of forest conservation. So I would also like to take some time to discuss the broader conceptual framing of the book. And so in this book, what I do is that I largely speak about political ecology by situating, because power dynamics is is one of the most integral area of focus of this book. I had worked on forest conservation, the politics of forest conservation, using a political ecology perspective. So this book is largely on the Sundarbans. It draws on my one whole year of empirical fieldwork in the Indian Sundarbans. And there are some specific interconnected threads which join this book together, I think. And one very, very integral idea that I think centers the main conceptual framing of the book on political ecology is exploring how vulnerable ecologies, because Sundarban is an extremely vulnerable landscape. It has, in the recent years, the risks have even, I will come to that, but just to give a brief, in the recent years, we can see that the risks have even escalated. So I largely try to explore how these kinds of vulnerable ecologies shape claims to resources, and also how such ecologies shape the material relations as well as human identity. So Jinia was talking about cultural politics. I think that is also a major area of focus in this work. Now, there can be a question that why political ecology? Why centering political ecology as fundamental? Why I centered political ecology as fundamental to this work? I think the main reason is that political ecology is the only analytical framework which foregrounds these issues of power asymmetries, issues of inequities, issues of social injustice amidst nature. And I think while I talk about the ethnography of the region, I think that power asymmetries, inequities, social inequities, and injustice, these are some of the major issues around which the entire discourse revolves. And to this end, I think in this book, I aim to understand how the prevailing conservation norms affect the existing social and institutional structures, and how the entire realm of the forest livelihoods becomes a political realm to this effect. Now, in the introduction of the book itself, I spend a bit of time to conceptually foreground the issues of power asymmetries, inequities, and social justice as very, very critical imperatives in framing the entire conservation politics that I talk about in India. So what I do is that initially I start by contextualizing what conservation politics means in the larger landscape of India. And I do so because I wanted, in a way, I wanted to move beyond certain discourses which see conservation in a very, very simplistic way, which define conservation as strictly as a process that is animated by the state and the local community. So I had in a way tried to transcend this view, which sees conservation as very, very strictly defined by the state, or those which rely on a very simplistic portrayal of local communities. Because I thought that doing so would prompt the readers towards recognizing ecological conflicts as much more non-linear, as checkered, and this will afford shifting the discourses towards capturing more of complexities within the place-based framings. Now, a bit to introduce the landscape, which I will do broadly later on. So Sundarbans, as many of us know, that it is the largest stretch of mangrove forests. It is also declared as the UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 for its very, very unique physical attributes, its range of wildlife, biodiversity, aquatic resources. So we all know about the Royal Bengal tiger, which is one of the flagship species in the region. But another very, very unique aspect about the physicality of Sundarbans is the fact that it is situated in a very important geopolitical boundary. It extends across Bangladesh and India. The Indian part is largely known as the Sundarban Biosphere Reserve, and it covers approximately 9,630 square kilometers. But something that I focus on this book, something that is very little known about, is the fact that the Indian Sundarbans also has an extensive stretch of human habitations, which occupy more than half of this 9,630 square kilometer. These inhabited areas, they largely fall within two districts. So the Indian part of the Sundarbans is located in the district of West Bengal, shared between the state of West Bengal, shared between the districts of North and South 24 Parganas. And there are 19 blocks across these two districts. And a large number of people, particularly people who inhabit the forest adjoining islands, they depend on the forests for their, very integrally, they depend on the forests for their livelihoods. Now, as I said that I would also be, before going on to share the empirical findings of this work, I would also be interested to share some of the very, very overarching questions which guide this research, which were raised through a range of very, very prolific academic literature on conservation politics. So some of the books that you can already see here. And most of the books, these are, I feel that these have been, these had done an extremely path-breaking analysis of showing how conservation policies, forest policies, even the contemporary decentralized ones, had actually worked to the detriment of the marginal classes by restricting their livelihoods. And it had been a very, very primary strategy that had been reinforced to sustain the political imperatives of industrial development. Now, also to talk a bit, because this book is about forest conservation, to talk a bit about the forest policies itself. So forest policies, as we see, that very similar to what was there in the pre-independence period, in post-independent India also, before the trends towards reform, the trends towards decentralization that we largely began seeing from the 1990s, there had been, we saw that most of these policies had been formulated mirroring the colonial policies themselves, and which at large converted majority of the national forest lands into state property. then eventually there was also a time when rapid decline in the forest cover because of the increasing demands of industrialization actually prompted the states towards drafting much more rigorous wildlife conservation policies, primarily from the 1970s. So we know about the Wildlife Protection Act. So one shift that was traced during this period, during the shift from the pre-colonial to the post-colonial policies, had been this increasing focus on wildlife conservation, which was not there earlier. But then again, these rigorous wildlife conservation policies also, to a large extent, they excluded the needs of the local communities, and resulting from a wide-scaled protest from all these communities for a very long period of time. We saw that there had been some efforts towards democratization of forest policies, which largely initiated with the National Forest Policy. We saw a large-scale organizational restructuring through decentralization, because the state at some point realized that in order to conserve the forests, they would need cooperation of the local communities. But then these decentralized policies on ground, when they were implemented, they also, in a sense, the spirit of collaborative forest governance mechanisms, which I also focus in this book through the discussions on joint forest management, actually got marred to a large extent, because there was a lot of, in the name of collaboration, in the name of participation, there was rarely or barely there was any kind of local right that had been recognized, but there was more of an elite influence of the local elites, influence different kinds of political imperatives that had actually been seen. Now, recent works also propose a convivial conservation, as you can see in this very recent book that is authored by Bram Buscher and Robert Fletcher. So this is also a very interesting work that I build upon a vision of a politics, a set of governance principles that can very, very realistically respond to some of the core pressures of our time. There is also a range of other works that are relevant here for the book. So for instance, the literature on forest governmentality, which I focus a lot in this book, it explores how by reshaping all these forest legislations through new laws, through new regulations and new procedures, ultimately what we did was that we created a whole new range of environmental subjects who did not only adapt to the environmental regulatory practices as set by the state, but also they changed their behavior from one of initial resistance that we saw earlier to a very, very proactive political participation in forest management. Now, conceptually foregrounding in many such approaches which directly focus or foreground on political ecology, I ask three very, very integral questions in this book. Now, one question is how vulnerable risk-prone ecologies, as I was saying earlier, how these vulnerable risk-prone ecologies shape material social economic relations and also institutional contexts of forest communities. Also, another question, something that was of a particular interest to me, because I talk a lot about policies in this book, was that how are policy choices determined within ecologies with such sharply disaggregated social interests? And also, another last question, that why increasing participatory powers and empowerment policies that are mandated within the recent decentralized conservation frameworks, why they fail to reduce socioeconomic marginalization? So coming a bit directly to the field explorations and operationalization of the study. So as I was saying, that the Indian Sundarbans is largely a fragile and a vulnerable ecosystem prone to different kinds of threats, real life threats. And in the recent years, we see that the threats have even increased manifold due to the devastating effects of climate change. We see a large rise in the sea level accompanied by very, very strong tidal waves, which have eroded away large chunks of landmass. So all of us know about the recent cyclones like Amphan and Bulbul, on which we have also written about. And so all these extreme weather events have actually eroded, they have caused a lot of erosion, they have depleted a large range of mangroves, and necessitating a further need of devising much robust and better international conservation policies in order to oversee the administration of the region. But one thing that I also want to mention here is that why Sundarbans is a global conservation landscape, and why it attracts a lot of international attention, is not only because the region is endangered, but also because it is the largest remaining tract of the Royal Bengal tiger, which occupies a very, very integral core in the food chain, and it is also globally known for its human-eating trait, something that is again very, very contested. And the geography of this landscape is also very unique. It is partly forested, it is partly inhabited. One thing that is again very unique here is that there are no human habitations inside the forest area. So all the habitations are the forest dependent, the forest workers. We mostly find them in the forest fringe. The land is extremely vulnerable. The inhabited areas, most of the inhabited areas, primarily in the active delta, they are still in the process of land making. In the extreme northern limits of the biosphere reserve, which were reclaimed earlier during the 18th and the 19th century, there we still find well-knit, physically stable settlements, which share close proximity with the mainland cities. But the active delta where I stayed in two forest fringe villages in the island of Shatjelia in the Goshaba block, which is situated in the South 24 Parganas district. So these areas are particularly vulnerable because the river is always changing its course, leading to a large scale erosion of the landscapes almost every day. So the fieldwork, I stayed in these two villages for about a year between 2015 and 2016 during my PhD, and also for shorter periods later on as well. I chose ethnography as a method because I felt that ethnography, as Jinyadi was also mentioning earlier, that I felt that there is a need to develop ethnography as a co-constituted and a co-constructed framework. And this could also be for me, this could also be a method where I had the possibilities to use a integrated inductive research design and integrated descriptive research design. And also the primary reason for choosing the island of Shatjelia was its peripheral location at the forest fringe, sharing very, very close proximity with the forest and being one of the most fragile and risk-prone landscape with practically little or no livelihoods apart from that of the forest work. So I would now go directly a bit to share the empirical findings. There are three primary empirical chapters in this book. So in the third chapter, I primarily explain relationships between the people and the forest. And I do so by mainstreaming politics as a context, institutional politics as a context within political ecology. And here, by using an ethnography as a practice within these two villages, Emilibari and Pathopara, where I was staying, it actually enabled an understanding of the different social structures being largely shaped by institutional approaches to forest conservation, different kinds of ways in which people mediate across multiple political scales for their own survival amidst these ecologically prioritized landscapes. And this chapter also provides an account of the different kinds of anxieties associated with inhabiting these endangered and rapidly eroding landscape, because this I found to be a sociality which is largely comprised of very, very diverse imaginations about the forest, and there are different kinds of ongoing contestations within the social groups which actually afford a deeper and a much more transformative understanding of the forest communities as associated to nature. Now, looking into all these realities through the ethnography that I tried to practice, one integral question that again came to my mind had been to ask that what are the processes through which these dominant transforming trends within the forest-based life worlds, what are the processes through which these transforming trends are actually unfolding? And what are the events which lead to considering political action as the most viable strategies of living in a vulnerable geopolitical landscape? So what I do is that in these empirical chapters, I try to provide an upfront account of these dimensions as instrumental in understanding lived spaces amidst the vulnerable ecologies. So what I observed had been in the first chapter, that is on people and forests. I found that certain structural socialities actually make the inhabited landscape a very, very unique context of exploration, because this is something that I also call a politics of belongingness, with which earlier one very recent paper by Ajit Menon and Mansi Karthik had also focused on in a very, very different context. So a very unique politics of belongingness can be traced across this region, since the entire community inhabiting the island are migrants. The population largely belongs to three categories: the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, the other backward classes, the OBCs, with a minuscule of Christians and Muslims. People are mostly from Bangladesh, but also from different adjoining regions like Midnapur, Jharkhand, Bihar, and Orissa. And one specific social organization, which I think Professor Anu Jalai very, very broadly and exhaustively mentions in her fascinating book, Forest of Tigers, is that since the entire population belongs to lower caste orders, social status is, rather than being determined by the strict hierarchy, social status is more determined through land locations, land structure, and as well as the nature of occupations that are practiced in the different islands of Sundarban. So for instance, the people who are staying nearer to the forests, they are always considered unsophisticated, lacking material culture. And also another one very fascinating observation that she had made is that these forests, this entire realm of the forest related livelihood practices are materially shunned by the local elite. So one line that she mentions in her book is that in the hierarchy of the geographical locations, the worst places that one could choose to settle on are the peripheries of the islands adjoining the forest, at the gates of the tiger's lair. So I think this is actually a very, very blatant practical reality, because positions in the better island interiors, and I found that it is not only related to social status, but also to very strong political agencies in communicating much more effectively to the bureaucratic sphere and also shaping dominant environmental agendas. So in Shajili, I found that people primarily subsist on agriculture, forest work, and petty trades within the villages. People who are well off, they aspire to buy plots of land around the city of Calcutta. There is a large-scale migration, and these category of the forest workers, they usually reside along the river bunds, spaces which are physically vulnerable, places which are closest to the forest. They engage themselves in small-scale artisanal fishing in the river creeks, prawn seed collection, crab harvesting, collecting honey, shell collection. And also another very, very unique aspect of this region, as I think many of us know, that forest livelihoods are largely congruent with religious identification. The realm of the forest is considered to be largely sacred. The worship of forest goddess Bonbibi is extremely predominant. So Bonbibi prevails as a predominant religion of the forest, which is not affected or which is not impacted by any kind of social division that manifests in the land. And this belief actually mandates that people who follow forest norms don't over extract resources, and they should treat the forest as sacred. However, it's also very useful to mention here that the predominant narratives of conservation in the recent times, as they are enforced on the landscape, as they're enforced on the people, actually requires a more nuanced understanding of the local environmental agendas as transformative. Because largely the realm of the forest is perhaps the only one where we find relations of solidarity and brotherhood. That too on the sole conviction that collective action is indispensable for combating potential risks. So I felt that on a larger material level, the ethos of Bonbibi to a large extent are also on the decline. So again, this is the pictures. These pictures are actually taken. So one from Disha and another also from a work by Shantanu Chakraborty, who had published a very, very fascinating report on the fish workers of Sundarbans some years back when I was doing my PhD. So the fourth empirical chapter actually focuses on forest-based livelihoods, the fishing practices. It also focuses on survival crisis, and as I was saying, the politics of belongingness in the conservation landscapes. And what it also shows is that in a socially unequal landscape, exclusionary conservation doesn't merely manifest into state-community conflicts, but it rather operates through a much checkered micropolitics, political actions across institutions, across actors, which play an instrumental role in articulating and embodying identities as legitimate, in authenticating rights, in constituting practices. And the conservation micropolitics so shaped also allows us to explore how these existing inequities, the social political inequities, are largely altered and reconstituted. But I think we can come to that a bit later after looking onto directly some fishing practices. So there are three kinds of activities: harvesting crabs, fishing, and prawn seed collection, the three main fishing livelihoods that are practiced in the forested creeks and rivers. And these also involve three very, very discrete locations. So while catching crabs, the forest fishers, they enter the narrowest river creeks within the forests, which are inundated during the high tides and which are dry during the low tides. Fishing primarily occurs in the creeks, but also in the main river bodies, apart from a few fish species that are found in the creeks. And prawn seed collection is mostly done along the river banks with pulling nets. And in several cases, we find that the fishers, it's a multiple day fishing because the fishers have to travel at least a day to reach the location, to reach the fishing spots. And their trips last for about 7 to 14 days during the fishing seasons. Prawn seed collection, on the other hand, is a relatively localized occupation, which prawn seeds can be caught while pulling the fishing nets along the banks of the river, or maybe from a boat as well. So fishing primarily occurs from June to the end of October. The nets and the gears that are used locally, they are known as galsha, beundi, katadon, khepla, khalpata, and charpata. These are all local names. They also have their original names, which I've used in the book. And one very, very unique feature of these gears are their very discrete uses depending on the nature of the khal or the forest creeks. So khal is also, it's a local term for the forest creeks. And the crab harvesting season, on the other hand, it largely depends on the lunar cycle. It roughly extends from September to March, although the best catch is expected from November to March. It follows a lunar cycle, and fishers here mostly use line nets. So all these activities are very, very discreet. And although people, as I was saying earlier, that people are mostly migrants. So all this knowledge that are involved in the use of these gears, in the very, very specific techniques that are employed to harvest fish, all these knowledge also are very, very locality specific. So understanding the realm of the forest-based livelihoods is very integral to this study because, as I was saying, that alongside the livelihood practices, it also allows us to explore the politics of belongingness, because despite having an established cultural integrity, and also practicing traditional occupations, the forest workers, we find that in the Sundarbans, they are not indigenous. They are often referred to as unauthentic claimants. And this is also the reason why multiple times they are subjected to political marginalization. They are treated as others. They are treated as settlers. And we find a range of ongoing reforms exclusively focus on rights with actually no regard to legitimizing the mainstream these kinds of local practices of livelihood. But rather, since the recognition, the identities are marred by political shapings, it is also a reality that political activism on the legitimation of rights is largely construed to the interests of the dominant groups, the dominant social groups. And I think I also position ongoing debates on reframing the ideas of community, mostly as subjects of forest governmentality, And in this context, why I do so is because it is very significant to see how integral are the making of rights. So what rights are legitimate, what rights are not. These are extremely integral, and these are extremely important, significant observations in making a sense of how the human spaces are prioritized amidst the globally recognized wilderness scapes. Because in most of the cases, mobilization towards rights are not politically neutral. And here a political ecology analysis actually helps understand that it is mostly the powerful institutions and political actors which represent very distinctive agendas on legitimation of rights as collective priorities. And mostly we find that marginal forest workers, they are denied rights to extract resources, not only because of the state community conflicts, not only because of the conservation laws, but also because the communities are non-natives and they do not belong to the landscape, which largely works to a detriment in claiming rights to livelihoods. So these pictures, as you can see here, I had taken these during my field work, and this is something which again is extremely worrying. This picture shows a large number of women, and many of them are very young. So they are commonly referred to as tiger widows because their husbands have been killed by tigers when they went inside the forests to to harvest fish or collect honey. And it's again a very, very depressing scenario, and it's a very, very sort of troubling scenario in terms of the conservation policies, in terms of how the conservation policies manifest, because there are different kinds of things. So for instance, many forest workers, they collectively believe that most of the deaths that are occurring in the core areas, they are in most of the cases, they are not reported, fearing hefty fines, fearing abuse, and such deaths even cannot be mourned in the villages. And in several cases, the bodies of the deceased people are abandoned to the tigers. They are not brought back in the fear of the forest guards. And even if accidents, so one term that they use to designate these incidences of people being killed by a tiger is known as accident. So even if such an accident happens in the buffer area, and even if the body of the victim can be recovered, the family has to go through a series of essentially very, very complex methods to claim compensation, because in most of the cases, establishing the case of death is extremely arduous, since the forest guards accompany the companions of the deceased to locate the place of accident, but they mostly do so in an atmosphere of suspicion. And the deaths which occur in the core areas, they are not only unrecognized, but they are also refused by the forest department. So for instance, I remember talking to one fisherwoman who stated that her husband was killed and was taken away by a tiger in a specific buffer forest area. And while his fellow fishers had actually reported the incident to the forest department, to the nearby police station in an area known as Chotomulla Khali, the police actually refused to believe about the accident, and they did not even record the missing diary. And forest workers mentioned that in most of the cases, the police stations also, they do not report the incidences of accidents without the approval of the forest department. And thus in most of the cases, people do not receive any compensation. And even if they receive compensation, a lot of it has to be goes in greasing the palms of the political parties. But also, there are certain livelihood practices. I think this Professor Amitesh Mukhopadhyay has also discussed this exhaustively. So there are certain livelihood practices which are even if they are unsustainable, they are widely practiced, because the main reason is because they work through very distinct relations of power. And in this case, contrary to the other forms of forest works, we see that rights can be very easily legitimated because they are connected to the political nexus. So prawn seed harvesting and the setting up of prawn fisheries, we all know that it poses very critical challenges to the ecology, but nevertheless, these occupations persist through different kinds of strategies. They persist as key practices of livelihood. And an ethnography of the prawn harvesting practices in the villages actually provides a very engaging political ecology account on the ways in which very, very powerful and autonomous voices predominate in the making of legitimation, making and legitimation of local claims to the livelihoods. Now, as I was saying, that I also focus a lot on rights-based policies in my work, and one of the most integral policy that I focus on while talking about decentralization is that of the Forest Rights Act. So I do this in a bit different way by talking about the political agenda. So rather than directly talking about the bureaucratic impediments of the act, what I find more useful is talking about the political agenda of implementing this act. So just to give a bit of background, that so I think that understanding this entire gamut of implementation of the rights-based forest policies is a very, very integral exercise that can be done with a political ecology analysis. And we all know that the Forest Rights Act had been an iconic legislation recognizing for the very first time the rights of the forest-dependent communities. But despite having sufficient scope of being implemented in the two districts of North and South 24 Parganas, it has not yet been implemented because of because of a very, very strong political nexus. And according to most of the state functionaries, they believe that the communities in these regions are not authentic claimants because they are non-natives. But as I said, that apart from, definitely I look into the bureaucratic impediments, but apart from that, I have also tried to explore a political agenda where rather than simply addressing the bureaucratic mechanisms hindering the implementation of the act, the observations actually allow me to argue that the implementation of these kinds of decentralized frameworks are not only instrumented by the state, but they are very deeply implicated within contending local political interests. And it also sort of makes visible how instead of ascribing rights and executionary powers to the actual forest communities who are dependent on the forest resources, decentralized forest governance actually allows significant scope for the dominant local political interest groups to align with different levels of power, provincial level, subnational level, sub-district level, national levels. And one thing, so I would not be having time to go into the details, but one very integral observation had been that while I tried to talk to different party workers, and while most of them apparently supported the cause of implementation when I asked, but the realities, as you get from the local people, the realities are very, very converse. So there had been several examples of impeding the campaigns for the implementation of the act. And this is actually a way in which the party workers, the panchayat functionaries, they reconstruct the regulatory power that is sustained by the bureaucracy in denying access of the primary stakeholders. And I think that it is worth, so since we are talking about the rights-based policies, it's also worth looking into the converse reality. So one, as I was in the beginning of this talk, I was talking about the participatory policy. So Forest Rights Act definitely is not, in spirit, it's not participatory. It's a rights-based policy because it accords entire rights of forest use to the Gram Sabha. But on the other hand, the joint forest management. So why joint forest management is so successful in most of the Sundarban area, and why Forest Rights Act is not, I think the only reason is because joint forest management renders a much stronger scope for the bureaucracy to participate much more directly in benefit sharing, and as well as in controlling the entire policy, the entire process, the entire way in which joint forest management operates. So there, again, I would not be able to go into the details, but a range of observation from joint forest management reveals corruption, lack of benefit sharing, instances of surpassing actual target groups to whom the benefits should have accrued. And mostly the memberships within the joint forest management committees reveal power play and political relations that are animated by the abilities of the people to align with the dominant political groups in the village. whereas the marginal and the landless forest workers, who should apparently be the main beneficiaries of the JFM, are mostly left out of decision making. Similarly, usufruct benefits, they almost never are shared with the forest workers. They are only shared with a handful of elites in the village. For instance, we see that members of the executive committees, they establish big poultry farms and different other irrigation related equipments, denying the benefits that are entitled to the forest workers. And I largely elaborate in my book on the operation of joint forest management as that of intimate governance, something that Arun Agarwal mentions, where in the name of participation, it's actually, we see that there are dispersed centers of environmental authority that are at work in the form of joint forest management committees. And also another very interesting fact, that we often believe that if there is a constellation of interest, if there are collective interests, they would translate into aggregate social preferences, but that is not the case. Because again, we see that policies like joint forest management are mostly manifestations of governmental discipline. So in the end, I will just take a bit of more time to share the key findings. And this work has largely been a project to navigate to the current institutional mechanisms of forest conservation and understanding how they differ from their past approaches and how critical had been their role in redefining the material social organizations, primarily in vulnerable environments, vulnerable landscapes. Also something that I do in the book, I did not get time to discuss that broadly, had been to study about the non-human political ecology. So for instance, in most of the cases, we find that people claim that political ecology is largely human-centric. But something that this is one view that I actually critiqued in this work, because I found that political ecology also has a significant scope to understand how animals are also non-humans, can also be constituted as political subjects in the process of forest conservation. To this end, I discuss a large range of literature, and also I try to draw on different observations from the Sundarbans, where I find that almost like humans, tigers, I find they are also subjected within a network of regulation, within a network of control, within the processes of subjugation. And I think that these kinds of justice frameworks in political ecology can actually have a very good scope in reconstructing interspecies subjections. And political ecology can actually enhance the scope of justice frameworks by accounting for different kinds of subjective representations of humans in a largely in a political power-ridden political process in different kinds of co-produced ideological practices. So just to sum it up, using a political ecology framing in this book had been an attempt to rethink about the ways in which how humans and nature associate to each other and situate different kinds of acts and strategies in positioning themselves in a very, very contested geopolitical conservation landscape. The book also reflects on a sociality that is influenced by very, very new environmental conservation agendas, and also their own discrete transformational roles in bringing local actors close to forest governmentalities, something that drawing on Agarwal, can be referred to as intimate governance. And also something just to end with is that the book has also provided some scope to understand newer political economies within the recent subnational as well as the national arrangements in sort of aiding or increasing the capacity of the existing conservation institutions. And I largely feel that this study actually offers a newer way to see conservation politics as one that is often translated into political mechanisms, that is sort of instituted through political choices, something drawing on Prakash Kashman, something that can also be called mechanisms of political intermediation, one that is shaped through different kinds of means and strategies like politically engaged movements, structured advocacies, and different mechanisms of representation at multiple levels, the national level, subnational levels, as well as the local level. So I'm also very happy to share some of the reviews that I got out of this book. And yeah, so just like towards the end, I would also, I think I should thank this project, DFM project, a lot, because when I was completing my work, when I defended my PhD, I really wanted to take this work forward. And then when this project came, I just got an opportunity. I think it was the most apt opportunity for me to think ahead of the work that I had already been doing. So I could not focus much on dry fish economies in the Sundarban region, which occupies a very, very fundamental and integral sort of area, location. So we have already started doing a range of fieldwork in different areas. Like very recently, I was not there, but our group had been to the Fraserganj area, where there were different, as you can see, that we have also come up with multiple reports very recently, where we are trying to do an extensive analysis, drawing on different kinds of dry fish value chain, looking into the different kinds of different patterns of fishing administration, co-management, co-monitoring, partnership, which had again been something that was very integral in my earlier work in the Sundarbans. And also, like, more than, I am definitely very happy to participate in this project, but more than participating, I think I would get a lot of chance to know about newer ways of exploring the political economy, as well as the different aspects of dry fish economy that we would be looking into in the coming days. So yeah, so also just one last reflection. We are also trying to very recently, we have planned this project, which we call the situated adaptive practices, where we try to look into, so we talk a lot about climate risks in the Sundarbans, but we are trying to look more into this by activating agencies towards an integrated climate risk adaptation action plan through interinstitutional and intersectoral convergence and coordination in the Indian Sundarban Delta. I don't know if Aditya Dai is here, but he's also part of this project that we have planned. Jinyadi is also there, where we are trying to look into multiple action plans, multiple intersectoral action plans, and trying to do a broad scoping of different kinds of community practices on one hand, bottoms up community practices on one hand, and also drawing through this very detailed scoping, drawing on the top down policy driven public and private different kinds of missions and schemes, and see how we can activate the agencies of the actors. Because one thing that we felt time and again had been the fact that most often, like very commonly, we've seen that the climate action plans, the different kinds of sort of missions targeting the vulnerabilities, addressing the vulnerabilities, they are addressed through external mechanisms. So what we tried also, something that had been very integral, was to tap the local practices, needs driven community practices, because we had already done a couple of interviews with different communities there, and we were very intrigued to know that people are actually thinking about climate change adaptation in a very, very different way than what the formalized policies had been thinking about. So this is essentially a work in progress. We also we are hopeful that we would be getting a bit newer frameworks from this research that we will share. We would be sharing at a later stage. So yes, thank you.
So thank you very much, Amrita. Thank you for this amazing presentation. And I think that not only the empirical insights, of course, the empirical insights were great, but I also think the theoretical background that you provided when you started this presentation, and which has also been extensively covered in your book, especially the introductory section. I think this is very useful for researchers committed to pursue environmental social science research. So I think we should start the Q&A round now, and I think I would request Derek to because Derek has a couple of questions. So yes, Derek.
Thank you, Genia, for that. And Amrita, I'm floored. This is I'm so inspired by what I've just heard. This is an expression of really top-notch political ecology. This is it is such rich research and such a fascinating conceptualization as well. And so there's so many questions I could ask. I could really dominate this discussion, but I know that others will also have many questions. I'll just pick out a few points and then maybe conclude with a question to start the discussion. But this these simultaneous hierarchies of distance from urban to forest landscape is a fascinating way of thinking about, how sort of the cultural dimensions of political ecology. So that really stuck out to me, and then how that articulates with these sort of tiered levels of political power, from state power through local elites to then the most marginalized groups, and then how this irony of marginalization being associated with non-indigenous status. It's striking. And then the very poignant way that you captured the effective power of marginalization through the example of tigers, and how the inability to recover bodies and the sort of aggressive ways in which local authorities interfere with the ability of people to engage in mourning of their dead. That just reinforces the inequities that you've been talking about. And you had a really fascinating approach to rights. So let me give you two questions to chew on. So on the rights question, one response to your critique of rights would be that rights are actually a dead end. The rights-based approaches can't work because they are obviously subject to elite capture in the case that you described. But is there a way of reconfiguring rights? A way of reconfiguring rights that can somehow embody this, this attentiveness to diversity that exists within these ecologically embedded populations? Is that a strategy to reconfiguring rights, or do we need to get rid of rights and find something else that's more appropriate? So that's question one. Question two is, of course, as leading the DFM project, I need to ask something about dried fish. But where does wild capture processing of fish fit within this complex story that you're telling? Where is that on this hierarchy of distance from power? And is that also subject to elite capture? So, how do these interests of capital politics relate to the dried fish sector, or is the dried fish sector somehow outside of the power politics that you've described?
Okay. Should I take these questions, Derek, and
Yes.
then?
I think so.
Yeah. So I think for the second question, I will need a bit of Genia's help. But I think that the first question is extremely relevant, Derek, because this was something that kept me thinking for a long time, because all kinds of these rights-based policies, decentralized policies that we saw, they guaranteed rights without any power. That was the fix. So, if we see the policies, there will be a lot of, so in the joint forest management mainstream policies, for instance, executive committees should be constituted with people who are directly visiting, who are directly dependent on the forest. But what we see in the committee instead is that there is a there might be a tribal in the committee, but his presence is just a token presence. So when I tried to speak to him, there was another person from a very, very strong sort of political lobby who was saying that he doesn't know anything. He's always intoxicated. So please talk to me. So one thing that I would like to point out here is that we cannot do without rights. So as you say, that should rights be eliminated or should rights exist, but in a different way. But I personally, I feel a lot that decentralized, participatory, rights-based policies are of no use if we are devolving rights and legitimacy without any power. So we have to brainstorm a lot on how we can devolve power and recognition, and also the capacities that these people have. Because, so for instance, if you talk to a person who is regularly going inside the forest, that person can tell you a lot about, so for instance, that person can tell you a lot about the fact that why mangroves are depleting, why there is so much of forest loss, the different kinds of reasons. And we need to know about those reasons. We need to, even if they are non-native, even if they're officially recorded as unauthentic, even if there is a very strong indigenous, nationalist, regionalist assertion that is attached to this kind of knowledge, we need to know them because these are alternatives. And I think this is also something that, as I was mentioning about one recent paper by Ajit Menon and Mansi Karthik, who talk about the same in the context of Tamil Nadu. That there is always this ethno-environmental fix that is, it is a very, very sedentary version that if we are accepting knowledge that is only coming from native indigenous communities. So I'm not saying that we need to glamorize knowledge. There are there are also flip sides to that. But what I'm trying to say is that if there is a recognition of indigenous knowledge, we should also try to take into consideration knowledge alternatives coming out of these communities where knowledge is mostly place-based, locality-specific, but they have a lot of relevance because they are being practiced for so long now.
Okay, so, I guess, so I'm hearing two answers to my question, basically. So one is the pragmatics. The pragmatics is that local knowledge is profoundly relevant to addressing, let's say, the on paper core motivations of what guides conservation policy. Okay, but, and the second part of your answer is that this is an institutional problem. So the policies provide guidance, but they don't provide the institutional basis for supporting the listening, the hearing of that knowledge. Okay. I want to continue this conversation with you, but I don't want to dominate the discussion. If you want to respond to that, go ahead. But otherwise, I think maybe we should turn to the dried fish question, or even turn to another question from the audience.
Yes, thanks, Derek, and thanks, Amrita, for responding to that. I think I also have a response, but I will just, for now, I will not, continue this discussion because I will have a chance because I will be wrapping up this session. So I think I can kind of add my opinions to this, especially in terms of the dry fishing sector in the southwestern part of the Indian Sundarbans. Yeah. So with this now, I think like there are some questions in the chat box, and so there's a question by. It's not a question, but it's a note of appreciation by Aklima, so who says that this book is very interesting. And PKN, I don't know whether this is Pradeep or not. This may be Pradeep. So Pradeep is also like congratulating you on this very powerful and what we call the timely book. And Pradeep also has a question. So Pradeep is asking that could you also reflect on the transboundary dynamics shaping the macro political ecology of the Indian Sundarbans? So, Amrita, would you like to take up this question? So, you have discussed micro political processes. Pradeep wants you to, yeah.
So, I guess this is this is also a very significant question. I'm just thinking how to address this. So, I think in my work specifically, one very like central way in which I sort of tried to do this, because I didn't get a lot of scope to talk about transboundary politics because I mostly focused on local dynamics, but something that was of very interest. So when I was talking about cultural identity, for instance, and this entire discourse around the making of rights, the making of claims. So I remember in one paper, Amrita Sen had actually mentioned about this, that it's very interesting to look into migration in and place it in the context of cultural politics in this way. So for instance, when we look into these same fish workers, so most of them are from Bangladesh, and they are caste fishers, as we know. But the moment so as long as they are in Bangladesh, they are natives, they are considered to be natives, they have their own caste-based identities. But the moment they are transgressing into the Indian subcontinent, they are becoming migrants, they are becoming they are becoming unauthentic, and they are becoming non-indigenous. So it's very interesting to see that how this identification specific to boundaries also work to the detriment of the identities. In getting recognized as an authentic fisher, as an authentic forest worker. So this is again something that we need to talk about, that whether we are talking about so when we talk about natives, whether we are taking into consideration their historical identities, or we are much more concerning ourselves with the localized framings of their culture, saying that it's much more transient, it is not situated to the landscape, saying that it is not sedentary and things like that. So I think this was one way in which this transboundary thing made a bit of sense in my work.
Yes, thank you, Amrita. And I think Derek has a comment on power dynamics and how that define the rights. And I think he also has complementary questions on that. So it's a bit complicated. So I'll help you, but I have also kind of put it in the chat box. So he's asking that, he's saying that you have mentioned that defining groups or individuals as native can serve as a form of denial of rights. So are there contested claims advanced by communities who view themselves as legitimately indigenous? Do any right-based claims bypass the state through appeal to international actors or discourses?
Yeah, okay. So if I understood the question correctly, Derek, I think that I was talking a lot about political struggles around making rights. Who is indigenous?
This is a question actually from Eric, not Derek.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, Eric. Yeah. So if I understood your question correctly, I think that a lot of so you might remember I was talking about different levels of intermediation. And for instance, in the making of the forest, in making claims towards the Forest Rights Act itself. So when I had different opportunities to talk to civic groups who are directly sort of engaged in making the act implemented in the region as early as possible. They are doing different kinds of movements. There are also different kinds of political events, elections, and multiple kinds of things that is there in this entire thing of making claim to the Forest Rights Act. So I think one of the most what do I say, effective form of demonstrating political action in this landscape is that of claiming rights, recognizing the fact that communities here are non-native. So that is why they take to different kinds of strategies in order to make their claims heard in a different way. So for instance, they are saying that we are not forest dwellers, but we are forest dependents. And that is again a major provision in the act. So even if we are not from this landscape, even if we are migrants, even if we are not natives, it doesn't make any difference, because the act also mentions that you can accord rights to people who are forest dependents, who do not stay inside the forest. So like this, there are also different kinds of strategies. And I would say that this is not only specific to Sundarbans. So for instance, people who had earlier also worked on indigenous right making, claim making, like Tanya Mureli, who had time and again written about the making of the articulation of indigenous voices, non-indigenous, how non-indigenous people articulate their rights in a way to make their claims sound as authentic. And then in this Partha Chatterjee's book, Politics of the Governed, in a way, he also talks about the fact that people who are displaced communities, how they adapt to different kinds of political strategies to sort of ensure that they are not evicted from the railway colonies of Kolkata. So I think this has happened time and again, and I feel that making of rights now is a very, very contemporary critical issue, and I would say a range of exhaustive demonstrations, movements, we see that people make a lot of effort to intermediate at different levels to sort of make their claims sound authentic. And there are different strategies that are employed to this end. I don't know if that answers your question, Eric.
Yes, I think that Kashwan's political intermediation, Kashwan Garske Lopez, that you have used, I think that's a very useful analytic in the book. Yeah. So I'll now request Shormishta Di to ask some questions. I don't know what questions Shormishta Di should have, but she has guided this thesis. But anyway.
Thanks, Dinia. Yeah, so this is not exactly the questions, but some observations. Okay, being a supervisor, it's a great moment for me, and it's my heartfelt congratulations to Amrita once again. Amrita has worked with me for long 6 years, first 2 years in MPhil and 4 years in PhD, and it was a long journey, but she was such a sincere and hardworking student that the 6 years she didn't just feel like, she just spent 6 years and within such a very rigorous field work and working together and jointly bringing up some good publications and so on. And I could see Amrita today, so your work has really brought to a real color, particularly in the academic field. So again, congratulations for that. It's an honor to be a supervisor, I should say. Okay, so,
thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I have some observations. So I was just listening patiently to what Derek's question and as well as his critical comments on your empirical work, as well as Professor Priyadasi. He raised this issue of micropolitics within the macro framework and a kind of macro vision of looking at the broader aspects of this political ecology. So, see, I have some observations, particularly the linking of your contributions to the political ecology of coastal commons. So, Jinia, I just would like to comment and give my observation that this particular work is a timely contribution where Amrita's work provides a powerful analysis of the concepts in terms of biodiversity, conservation, and politics. So the theory of access, control of resources. So it's a significant contribution in terms of distribution of environmental cost and benefit. And you also raised the comment rightly by bringing up Amrita Bhaviskar's work of cultural politics. So it is a post-structuralist approach which Amrita's book, it focuses on the understanding of the discourses, the discursive practices which argue about the power relationships. So her work, it has heavily drawn the theoretical aspects of Foucault's theories, then Richard Pitt and Michael Watts and Escobar's, their discursive practices of domination and suppression. So the cultural politics has been looked at in the context of Sundarban through conflicts over meanings tied to identity, over social practices, the process by which these meanings are articulated. So these are very important contribution and timely contribution to look at another observations on the coastal political ecology. So not only in the context of the small scale fisheries, but if we just look at this micro politics in a broader concept of macro coastal political ecology, because in the context of coastal politics, there has been very little work and theoretical concepts on political ecology in the coastal research, in the marine research is very less, although there are some of the very insightful works by Martin Barwink, and where he discussed about the coastal grabbing in terms of appropriation of coastal space. But if we try to link Amrita's contributions of political ecology, the forest political ecology, then there are many very strong simultaneous work which could be just leveled equally with the coastal politics, which has been studied or which could be studied in a very newer form, positioning these theoretical concepts of political ecology with the blue governance, with the territorialization, if you just relate it with the macro level of indigeneity, fishery governance, blue economy. So Amrita's this book, particularly the political ecology of forest literature, it could contribute immensely and can help us to rethink about this coastal ecology in India and the other coastal commons in many parts of Asia and Africa, where fisheries, it forms the most important sector in the coastal region, where there are many marginalized groups, the fishers, they act as agents for the grabbing of marine resources. There's the ties in the fishery sector. So these conflicts within these small scale fishers form an important element, which are also considered and studied from the perspective of injustice, misrepresentation. So these are the ongoing research which have been carefully delineated by the scholars. So Amrita's contribution of this book could be a very good help, as well as good for literature contribution to look at this research further. So this is my observation. Actually, I would like to just make in the context of the contribution of political ecology in forest as well as in the coast. Thank you. Thank you, Virginia.
Thank you very much for Vishali. And I think that that kind of collaboration that is also that is still continuing between the two of you, and the edited Routledge volume on regional political ecology. I think some of the chapters are also shedding light on these kind of issues. So thank you very much, and keep continuing this good work. So I think
also I just want to just take 1 minute and just like a bit of response to ma'am's question. I as you know that like ma'am knows that I had always been also interested to work on commons, but since it was getting a bit broad, I had to take it off my thesis, because I tried at a point, I tried to think about the embankments as commons, as coastal commons, and if we can do a kind of mapping of that. But also very recently, and I think we will very soon initiate a meeting with Derek as well for this, regarding the special issue that we about this maritime studies, where we have come up with a proposal, and here like we have actually also tried to bring in a bit of political ecology analysis in while talking about small scale fishing in the coastal cities, because we find a lot of biophysical shifts are happening in terms of sort of built nature, but how these biophysical shifts are also reconfiguring the capacities of the coastal fishers to stake their claims in very new ways. So this is again something that can be a very important and a significant line of analysis in the political ecology of coastal fishing, I feel.
Yeah. True.
Yes, true. Thank you both. So I think like we don't have much time left with us now. The discussion is being intriguing, fascinating. So, but you know the clock is ticking. So I think I'll just take.
I think Geniali, that Derek had a question on dry fishing. So we can, if we can like together attempt answering that as well.
Yes. I think that can be our concluding comment. Or,
yes.
Concluding remarks like that. So yes, we have Aditya with us, and Aditya is also a prolific researcher on the Sundarbans.
Thank you so much.
So,
And we are doing
Yeah.
a lot of work together. He
Yeah.
has very kindly given me a lot of scope to work with him. So I'm very grateful.
Nothing of the sort. I mean, I actually been informed and taught by Amrita in many ways, but anyway. Uh, so essentially, what I actually quickly wanted to touch upon is nothing broad, nothing macro, and so on. A few years ago, Jambudeep, I mean, you probably all know about Jambudeep fishing, sort of drying fish and the struggle that it had. And even when we're talking about power and the how powers evolved, so in that case, of course, the judgment went against the fishers. So in a sense that their right to dry fish in an island which was not as much forested or not as much, let's say, not even sort of a tiger movement area was found to be problematic. So this whole problematization around drying fish and the right to dry fish as opposed to the state's right to conserve Sundarbans as a coastal regulation zone or as a conservation zone has been kind of at a loggerheads for a substantially long time. And this ruling of Supreme Court, I think it was around 2000, I don't know, 2002 or 3, that it said that fisher folk cannot or could not dry fish on Jambudeep Island anymore because it was contravening with the rights of the state to conserve. So this is actually something where what I wanted to brought in to ask you about this whole idea of conservation vis-a-vis the idea of drying fish, which actually extends to the idea of livelihoods. Essentially, why were they drying fish? They were actually drying. So essentially, the question of livelihood, the right to livelihood, as opposed to the state's right to conserve, has been a very intrinsic kind of a conflict, which we see manifestations in the form of, let's say, crab catchers and the way they are hounded by the conservation teams and so on. So do you think that this whole idea of conservation as opposed to idea of livelihood in the structure of political ecology as we know it, and the way the rights, one right supersedes the other, or one right kind of sort of is more legitimate than the other, kind of considered as more legitimate as even by the judiciary of the state, of the country. And so would you want to reflect on that particular aspect as such, because that would be very interesting addition to the question of power that we were talking about earlier.
Of course. I think this is a very, very interesting and important question, Aditya. So, like my answer is that. So, for instance, when I was mostly looking into the forest-based livelihoods, for instance, and very clearly we can see that the newer framings of conservation politics goes against it, but again in a very new way. It's not the conventional state community and forest department state conflicts that we see nowadays. But something that strikes me in this newer version of conservation politics that we are talking about is also the fact about this entire idea of subject making, that we find that a large section of people, primarily people who are right now very important leaders in the executive committees of joint forest management, party workers and people like that, whose forefathers had been very integrally forest workers, and they were involved so integrally in fishing and honey collection, have now completely aligning a lot with the forest department. They have completely turned into environmental subjects, as Arun Agarwal says. And definitely, and these are again the same people who now have a very, very different idea and opinion about forest-based livelihoods, that these kinds of livelihoods are now denigrating, why people go inside the forest, they should not be doing that, they should migrate to other places and things like that. And that is why I feel that so when we are also talking about rights nowadays, we are talking about the politics of claiming rights, making rights. I think the entire discussion has changed. So it's not like, again, I was mentioning about this drawing on a work, that even if there is a constellation of interest, that is not translating into very, very identical articulation of rights towards the same causes. And I think this dynamics has to be recognized. So regarding these kinds of landscapes like Sundarbans, which are extremely vulnerable and people can go to any extent to eke a livelihood. And because another also very important aspect here that I want to mention is this entire ideology of the worship of Bon Bibi, which I found towards, in several cases, I found that it is now on a decline, that people it's not like I did not find a lot of like a valorization of the worship of Bon Bibi with several communities in the place. So yes, I think that rights are still articulated, rights are still manifested, but they are getting done in a very, very different way, because there is a lot of power play attached to it nowadays. And that, I think, shifts the entire discussion of conservation politics to a very, very different and new area. If that answers your question.
Yes, I think so. Like, thank you very much, and also, bringing to the fore this like the hyper valorization of Bono Bibi, because like we went to the field very recently.
Yes, yeah, I was just about to say. Yeah.
Yes, so 1.5 weeks back, and we had heard stories of Bono Bibi, and Bono Bibi is very much there in the vernacular literature as well. In vernacular myths and mythologies, and also when we went to Kumirmari, which is in Goshaba block, southeastern part of the Indian Sundarbans, I think there the Bono Bibi cult is still prevalent. But when we went to Fraserburn, which is in the Namkhana block, southwestern part of the Indian Sundarbans, we see that people, they are not really very much anchored to the worship of Bono Bibi cult anymore. And then when we ask questions that, why this is so they say that even like 10 years back, there were a lot of like jatras, which means jatras and palagans, which means like local theatrical performances, which assemble the dry fish workers. So just a quick point that when I'm discussing southwestern part or Namkhana, this is the dry fish area. So far as Indian Sundarbans is concerned, and when I'm discussing, or we are discussing like southeastern part, so this is mainly the area which is prevalent for small scale fisheries. Dry fish, they dry fish, some fish varieties, but that is mainly for subsistence, for their own consumption, and especially during times of environmental distress or crisis. So what is important is that that we also find very stark, dissimilarities or distinctions in terms of culture, in terms of cultural practices, when we are discussing different island geographies. So I think what is very important, so far as Sundarbans research is concerned, is that Derek, Amrita also talked about Anu Jalai and her own research about how these different islands are so heterogeneous, and distance and their proximity to the urban, to Kolkata, how that plays an important role. So that research is already there. But what we are also fascinated about with dry fish research is that this dry fish research in the southwestern part of the Sundarbans is actually providing us with lot of insights and very interesting perspectives, where we also understand that how these islands are also dissimilar in terms of cultural processes and material processes, practices, and liabilities. So I think our findings from the dry fish research itself will itself, it itself will be a very strong kind of an empirical finding, which will further advance research on the Indian Sundarbans. So thank you very much. And also a very final brief comment that I would like to make is that, because a whole lot of discussions actually went on about this rights-based approaches, and what Raktima has brilliantly put as noise and voice of policy in the scoping report. And what we have been able to do is that we have kind of we could go through, or we did a historiography exercise on all these various policies that are available in terms of fishing, coastal regulation zones, marine fisheries policies from 1897, colonial period, to the recent Blue Economy report, which just came out last year. And all these discussions were very relevant today. And Amrita has rightly mentioned that rights have been given, but unfortunately, the local institutions, they are not that empowered. But at the same time, there's a disclaimer that that I think, again, I'm quite stuck with this mediation or intermediation analytic, and I think there are like array of mediations and there are multiple mediative actors to absolutely complexify the situation. So I think Amrita's book and her contribution in this dry fish research and is great in the sense that it is also helping us to really apply our multi-layered or checkered understanding in terms of all these different acts and policies and all these like national level, regional level, local level documents that are there in terms of quote unquote protecting rights so far as small scale fishing or even dry fishers or dry fishing is concerned. So yes, thank you very much. I think it was a wonderful presentation, and I would encourage all of you to go through the book. It's very costly, so I will also request Amrita that Amrita can be generous to circulate the e-copy to people who are genuinely interested.
I was having a discussion with Eric towards the beginning of this presentation where we were exactly discussing, because the book is very costly, and I will be very happy to share the PDF once it's available, because the book is not yet officially launched. I got a bit late in submitting the final proof. I think it will be launched in this December. And again, I think I should thank a lot Derek, Eric, Jinyadi, everyone for giving me this platform to introduce and talk about my book. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amrita. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye.
Yeah.